This is video 2 part 4 on the How to Do Algebra series for solving equations. Now we're looking at method 1 again. There are two methods I'm teaching. This is not going to be method, we're not using inverse function machines on this video. If you want to see that one, look at 2.5 and 2.3. This is really aimed at higher students or foundation students that like this method. And what we're going to be looking at in this video is how to solve equations with brackets, multiple brackets on one side, unknowns on both sides, which means the x is unknown but it's on both sides of the equals, and then brackets on both sides. There will be a separate video on solving equations containing fractions, and that's the hardest part of these more basic equations before we get on to simultaneous equations. But don't underestimate those, because on a really difficult one containing brackets, fractions, unknowns on both sides, that can get up to grade A, particularly if it then leads to a quadratic. But anyway, let's start off by looking at some of these types of problems. Now if you remember in the previous video on method 1, we're using a method with the idea of balancing. Whatever we do to one side of the equation, we do to the other. So in this particular question, I want you to try and solve that by using that method. So in this particular problem, we've got to add 1 to both sides first. Now you can write it down underneath there, or you can write it to the side, or as you would do later on, not write it down at all. You'll just write down a second step without showing you what you've done. And then we're going to divide both sides by 2. And we get x is equal to 5 divided by 2, or 5 halves, or 2.5. Now what I mean by not showing your workings as clearly as that, or that's belt and braces, but you can actually write this. More advanced mathematicians, if you want, you can write it like that. I'm going to always write what I'm doing to help you, but you should really, particularly if you're looking at moving on to do A level, be looking at that as your workings. So here's a question. 2 lots of x minus 1 is equal to 8. Now there are a couple of ways of doing this. Now I'm going to show you one way, but the other way I will very briefly go through, and it works nicer sometimes and other times it doesn't. It depends whether the first step or not gives you a whole number. But the way that I'm going to teach you to do this is simply to expand the bracket. If you've got a bracket, expand it. Okay, now if you can't expand brackets, there's this video series in this playlist on how to expand brackets. So if you've got a bracket, just expand it. So we get 2x minus 2 is equal to 8. Now we've expanded the left hand side, there was nothing to expand on the right hand side, so there's nothing to do. Now we solve it as before, so we're adding 2 to both sides. And now we divide both sides by 2, and we get x is equal to 5. Okay, so that's it. When you've got brackets, get rid of them by expanding them, but expanding them carefully. Okay. The method that you could do though, this bracket is times by 2, so it's 2 lots of this. So rather than expanding the bracket, what we can do to both sides is divide by this 2. So we can say, well, let's divide by the 2 first. And that gives us x minus 1 equals 4. And then we add the 1 to both sides. And that gives us x equals 5 as well. But the reason why I don't use this method as often is that if that 8 there was not a multiple of 2, we wouldn't have got a whole number answer here for the 4, which means we would have had to deal with fractions. And typically students aren't as good at using fractions as they should be, so then they struggle with that last step. So much safer to expand the brackets, and then you won't get the fraction until the last step, and then you won't have to do anything with it except for maybe simplifying it. So that's it with fractions really, with brackets, sorry. You just expand the bracket. You just got to expand it carefully. So try that one please, expand the bracket and then solve it as we did in the previous video. Well, if we expand that bracket, we get 3x minus 6 is equal to 15. Because remember, we times everything but inside the bracket by the thing outside the bracket. Go and watch the other video if you in the series if you can't do that. It's called expanding brackets. And now we have to add 6 to both sides. So 3x is equal to 21. And now we divide both sides by 3. So we get x is equal to 7. And that's your answer. Okay, so using brackets is not very much harder, and that's a grade difference, a whole grade there. If you can expand that bracket and turn it into an easier question like that, then you should be okay. Now let's look at the slightly harder problem where you got 2 brackets. Now in this case you've just got to expand the 2 brackets carefully, but be very careful with brackets, particularly that symbol there, and we'll look at an example in a minute where you can get those wrong. So let's expand this first bracket first. 2 3s are 6, so that's 6x plus 2. Remember, you can use the grid as well if you prefer using the grid. So that's 6x plus 2. And now we've got plus 3 lots of x plus 2. So it's plus 3 lots of x, which is plus 3x, and plus 3 lots of 2, which is plus 6. Gives us the answer 6 because is equal to 6 because the right hand side hasn't changed. We haven't done anything to the left hand side other than expand the brackets. That's an important point. We haven't changed the left hand side. We haven't added, subtracted, multiplied, divided anything to the left hand side. We've just expanded the brackets. It just worked on the left hand side. Now we simplify the left hand side, so we get 6x plus 3x is 9x, 2 plus 6 is 8, and that is equal to 6. Now we're going to solve the equation. We've done the hard work, now we've got to solve the equation. So we're going to take 8 from both sides, and we get 9x equals to negative 2. And we're going to divide both sides by 9, and we get x equals negative 2 over 9, and that's the answer. We're going to look at the second example now, and on this second example what we're going to do is we're going to do the same. We're going to expand the brackets, but this is where you've got to be very careful. Now the students I teach, this is where I'll be telling them there's a crocodile in the water. There's something there to get you, so you've got to be very careful. There's a hidden problem in this question, and it's this negative here. And we'll look at why in a second. So let's first of all multiply out the first bracket. So I get 6x plus 2. Now, when we multiply out the second bracket, we've got to include this sign here, this negative 3, as part of the multiplication, as part of the expansion. So we get negative 3 lots of x, which is negative 3x, and negative 3 lots of 2, which is negative 6. Now, we haven't done anything to the left-hand side other than expand the brackets, so all we have to do is we don't do anything to the right-hand side. So I'd much prefer to see you using the grid here so you don't make problems. You don't miss problems. So minus 3x minus 6 there. Now we simplify and we get 3x minus 4 is equal to 6. And now we solve it as before. Add 4 to both sides and we get 3x equals 10. And we divide both sides by 3. And x equals 10 divided by 3. Now this step here is where loads of students lose marks. That's why I call it the crocodile. You've got to look out for the crocodiles because they're there to bite you. Right? They'll bite your legs off if you're not careful. You've got negative 3 times by x and negative 3 times by 2. So negative times by a positive gives a negative. Lots of students, when they expand that, fail to include the sign there. And we're going to work out the answer to this equation. So what I'd like you to do now is work that one out on your own, being careful of the crocodile, and then we'll compare answers in a minute. You should have done that by now. If you haven't done it, go on, do it. Don't watch me. Learn math by doing, please. So here we go. I'm going to multiply out the first bracket, and I get that. I'm going to multiply out the second bracket. and I get that. Now, if you haven't got that part of the expansion right, then the rest of the problem from here on in is wrong. Now remember, you're doing negative 3 lots of 2x, which is negative 6, and you're doing negative 3 lots of negative 1, which is positive 3. So many students get that bit wrong, and it's such a shame in an exam to see you get that bit wrong. Because now we can simplify. You would get method marks from now onwards, but these questions won't be worth many marks, so there's not that many method marks to gain. And now it's looking like an easier question. So now we add 1 to both sides, and we divide both sides by 2. And we can leave the answers as a fraction, or you can write it as a decimal. So be very careful when you're expanding brackets of the signs. Look out for the crocodiles, they will be there to bite you if you're not careful. So that's the second type, when you've got a harder double bracket in front. Now we're going to look at the third type of harder problems, and that's when you've got unknowns on both sides. Let's look at a nice easy example of that. So we've got 2x minus 1 is equal to x plus 3. Now I want you to look at this problem and think, why is it harder? Now this question is harder because we don't have the unknowns on one side and a number on the other. We have now got unknowns on both. Now notice that the unknown is the same. If they weren't the same, if that was an x and that was a y, that was an x there and that was a y there, then you couldn't actually solve this question to get a unique solution, a single solution. You could plot it as a whole series of solutions on a straight line, but you couldn't have one single solution. In order to get a single solution, you may look for the intersection of two lines to find a single point where if you are doing simultaneous equations. But this has got the same unknown here, so we can solve this to get a single answer. Right, so looking at it now, it's difficult because there's unknowns on both sides. So let's get rid of one of the unknowns on one side. That's it. I mean, that is a basic concept to it. And we always get rid of the smallest unknown. That's what I would strongly recommend you do in all cases, is get rid of the smallest unknown, because that way you don't work with negative numbers. We don't have to work with these negative numbers as much. So in this case, 1x is smaller than 2x, so I'm going to get rid of the x on this side. There it is, done. Because I now know the right hand side is equal to 3, or plus 3. So I've got to get, but to keep this balanced, because this is a balance, remember, I'm going to take x away from the left hand side, and I get x minus 1 is equal to 3, and now I add 1 to both sides, and I get x is equal to 4. And that's it. So when you have equations with unknowns on both sides, then just get rid of one of the unknowns on one side. That's it. That's all you have to do. (3x minus 1 is equal to 2x plus 4). Right. So which side has the smallest amount of unknowns? The right hand side. There's 2 of x's here, and there's 3 x's here. There's 2 lots of x here. There's 3 lots of x here. So we're going to get rid of that 2 lots of x by taking 2x on this side, and that gives me 4 on the right hand side. But I've also got to take away 2 x's from that side, so that gives me x take away 1 on that side. So now I add 1 to both sides, and I get x is equal to 5. That's it. Next question then. Remember, every time I write a question down, you can pause the video if you like, and then work it out for yourself. So there's the question. Okay, see if you can do that for yourself. Okay, what we're going to do then is we're going to get rid of the smallest number of x's on the right hand side, so let's get rid of that x there. So we've also got to get rid of an x on that side to keep it balanced, and that gives us that. Now we take 1 from both sides, and now we divide by 2. And there's the answer. Remember, you can leave it as a fraction, or write it as a decimal. If you're leaving it as a fraction, do simplify it though. Now, notice how this one is that once we had got rid of the unknowns on one side, we was left with a two-stage problem. Right, so we got 3x plus 1 equals negative 4x plus 8. Try and do this one, please. Think about it. What is the smallest number of x's? Is 3x bigger or smaller than negative 4x? It's bigger, isn't it? So we're going to get rid of the negative 4x. Now we get rid of a negative 4x by adding 4x to both sides. Now if you took 3x on both sides, you still would have worked, it's just you would have got a harder next step. So always try and get rid of the smallest number of x's. Now negative 4 is smaller than 3. So we get 7x plus 1 is equal to 8. Now we take 1 from both sides, and we get 7x is equal to 7. Now divide both sides by 7. You get x is equal to 1. Well done if you got that one right. So that's unknowns on both sides. So the only way they can make this any harder now is to put brackets on both sides. So here's a question where there's brackets on both sides. Now, as you might expect, all we have to do now is to expand brackets, then solve it as before. So expand the bracket carefully on the left hand side, and we get 8x minus 4. Expand the bracket carefully on the right hand side, and we get 6x plus 3. Now we're going to get rid of the smallest number of x's, which is 6x. So we take 6x from both sides, and we get 2x, take away 4 is equal to 3. Now we add 4 to both sides, 2x is equal to 7, and we divide both sides by 2. Oops, that's a 7 over 2. Okay, so that's the as far as they can really go with it. Okay, now they could put 2 brackets on the left and 2 brackets on the right, but it's just the same idea and the same method. So without fractions, that's as hard as they can go. Remember, if you've got a bracket, expand it. If you've got unknowns on both sides, then get rid of the smallest number of unknowns on one side, but remember, whatever you do to the one left hand side, you have to do to the right hand side. Okay. Right, here's going to put 5 questions for you to finish with, to just check that you understand these, and then you can go on and look at the video with fractions, which goes on to the harder grade material. Do these questions then, please, and when you're ready, restart the video to see if you're correct. Question 1 then, I'm going to expand the bracket to get 2x plus 2 equals 12. Subtract 2 from both sides to get 2x equals 10. Now remember, I wouldn't actually write that in there anymore, I'm just putting it in there for you. Now divided by 2, I get x is equal to 5. So if you've written this as 2x plus 2 equals 12, 2x equals 10, x equals 5, then I'm happy with that. But I don't want you to just go straight to the answer. Even though I know you can see that 5 plus 1 is 6 and 2 6s are 12, I do want you to show your workings at this stage. But you don't have to put all these what are you doing, so I'm putting that in there so that you understand. Okay, next question then. Expand the bracket to get 6x minus 3 equals 6. Then add 3 to both sides, and I get 6x is equal to 9. Divide both sides by 6, and I get x equals 9 over 6, which is 3 over 2. And you can leave it as a fraction. Well done if you got that one right. If you didn't, hopefully you can spot what you got wrong. Now, here's a crocodile question. So hopefully this crocodile didn't bite your legs off. 2 4s are 8, so we've got 8x minus 4. That's the first mistake that some students make. They forget to multiply out the bracket correctly. Now the second problem is this negative here. It's going to be negative 2x, negative 2 times by x, and negative 2. We now simplify it to get 6x minus 6 equals 1. We now add 6's to both sides, and we get 6x equals 7. We divide both sides by 6, and we get x equals 7 over 6, and that is the answer to that problem. Not as easy to spot, so you do need to show your workings. Now, if I was doing this question properly, then I would have written it like this. I would have done this first expansion properly. That's what I would show. So I don't want to see anything less than that in your workings, please. Don't try and jump steps to show how clever you are, because it's when you do that you make mistakes, and that's when you lose marks in an exam. Now this is the first one with his unknowns on both sides. I've made it slightly more complicated just to make it interesting. We've got a negative x on the right hand side, and we've got 3 x's on the left hand side, so we're going to get rid of the smallest one, which is this negative x. We're going to do that by adding x to both sides. So that gives us 4 x's plus 1 equals 2. Now we're going to subtract 1 from both sides, and we get 4x equals 1. And now we're going to divide both sides by 4, and we're going to get x is equal to 1/4. That's the answer to that one. And finally, E, a bit more of a challenge. Got to expand the bracket first carefully, avoiding crocodiles. There it is. That's the mistake that quite a few of you have made, I expect. Hopefully you haven't. Negative 2 times by 3 is negative 6. Now the smallest number of x's is this negative 2 on this side, so we're going to add 2 x's to both sides, and we get 5x, take away 3 is equal to negative 6. We're going to add 3 to both sides now. We get 5x equals negative 3. Now we're going to divide by 5, and we get x equals negative 3 over 5. Now hopefully you got those questions right. If you didn't, go back and watch the videos, try and spot the problems, be careful with the negatives, particularly when you're expanding brackets. And if you can't work out what you're doing wrong, come and see me any lunchtime and I'll help you out with that.